Good morning, everyone. Thank you for summing up the courage to get up so early in the morning and attend our first panel. Our first panelists are not your average Marxist authors, which I think is a good thing, a sign of a good dynamic on the left, basically of the fact that we are now in a position to sum up all these different voices and try to tackle the problems of the ongoing crisis and generally the problems of left organization in a different way, maybe with a accent on different kind of conundrums and problems. And it is also an opportunity for various segments or fractions on the left to enter what I hope to be a productive conversation or a productive argument, of course, based on evidence and on the developed theoretical notions. So I hope that you will find these two introductory presentations interesting. On my right also is Tom Medak from the MAMA Institute. He has been engaged in various discussions about the commons, especially about the digital commons. And again, that's another topic that is somehow been left to the margin of the mainstream discussions on the left. So I think it's again important to bring this topic into our view and to try to see how this particular issue of the commons and then of the digital commons will in a way can in a way be integrated into a wider left analysis and wider left debate. Tom will talk about civil society and political work on the left today, based on his, as I said, previous engagements with the problems of commons. So we will hear two presentations that are not in strict sense Marxian, that do not follow a Marxian pattern of argumentation, and I think that is potentially the value of these two contributions, and I hope that the debate afterwards will be fierce and based on arguments and evidence. So without any further ado, I will give the floor to Tom first, and afterwards Danijela will have the opportunity to present her contribution. Tom?
Thank you, Mislav.
Oh, sorry.
Just a small correction. I won't be speaking of the commons in any sense, not even broad sense. I will be speaking really about the work in civil society and on the left, and reflecting on some of the historic experiences. Let me begin by looking at the history. Oh, I'll be reading, I'm sorry, but I'm really bad at improvised talk, so I've sort of forced myself into writing, and I can sometimes read too quick, so yeah, please interrupt me if I'm too quick. Let me begin by looking at the history of the predicament on the left in Croatia and voicing an opinion that some in this round probably won't agree with. I see there are experts here better than me who could say more about this. And I'm happy to discuss, as my arguments here are admittedly more of an experiential character and crudely pragmatical rather than well-researched or scholarly. I'm neither expert in matters of organizational form on the left, nor in matters of understanding the civil society, nor in matters of recent history. I was asked by the organizers, whom I thank for their invitation and friendly encouragement, to present on this topic as a continuation of some previous informal discussions that we had. Therefore, please take the arguments that follow as potentially mistaken and hopefully polemical. Understanding the predicament of the left in retrospect. Harsh judgments have recently been passed on the role of leftist civil society organizations in the process of social transformation in Croatia over the last 2-3 decades. Judgments that are in part warranted, in part, to my mind, mistaken. And that can probably be best understood, those judgments can be best understood as a work of ideological resetting on the left. That narrative of judgment goes along these lines. Civil society initiatives and organizations of the 90s and early noughts have provided legitimation for the implementation of liberal reforms that, once in place, obfuscated the structural violence of capitalism behind the painfully achieved standard of liberal proceduralism. Transfixed by the violence of war, ethnic conflict, and nationalist chauvinism, they remained focused on the aberrations of local flavors of capitalism in the guise of tycoons, cronyism, and criminal aspects of privatization, while remaining blind to the violent and aberrant character of the capitalism as a system premised on exploitation. Ultimately, they served as a handmaiden in the process of replacement of the local criminal capitalist class with the less individual, more abstract, and more civilized forms of international corporate and financial capital, helping the liberal comprador bourgeoisie displace the crony nationalist bourgeoisie that carried out the work of primitive capitalist accumulation of the first moment. While these recriminations do serve the purpose of drawing the ideological fault lines between the positions on the left, or if you prefer, between the position of the left and the position of the liberal left, and cause some ideological soul-searching, particularly with the liberal left, they are not entirely true, as they misconstrue a specific historic evolution of liberalism that the local political and economic system is nowadays embedded in. Admittedly, though, the assumptions behind these recriminations probably do help us to understand the present moment and the dominant mindset of many among even progressive organizations, insofar as they schematically delineate the structural position of civil society in a liberal capitalist context that many of those actors subscribe to. That position is defined by the division of labor in capitalist democracies between the three sectors of the society, where the remit of civil society is dictated from without by the state and or the capital. Whatever civil society can achieve happens with the kind permission of those two. Hence, civil society on its own does not hold the capacity to transform the social dynamic, but it serves as a corrective and structurally absorbs its contradictions. But the said harsh judgments fail, to my mind, to understand the specific driving forces behind the evolution of political and economic liberalism in Croatia. Stating it bluntly, the liberal capitalism was part and parcel of the nationalist program to start with. Also, the transformation and privatization of the productive sector was sanctified by the same ideological ferment that pushed the society into the monoethnic nation state. The roots of this ideological ferment can be traced back to the late Yugoslav period, where a general feeling of discontent with the economic and political system caused by a hard and protracted economic crisis that started already in the late 60s and early 70s. So that discontent was widespread among broad segments of the society. By the end of the 80s, particularly after the failure of Ante Markovic's structural adjustment program and with ethnic tensions already at a boiling point, the overriding popular sentiment was that the Yugoslav social and economic model had failed. Many were ready to bail out on Yugoslavia as it was, and the nationalists provided the quick and dirty way out of that turmoil. This resignation can help explain the blank slate consent that broad segments of the society had given to the potent admixture of nationalism and capitalism. But the important point is this. it was the self-same historic actors who would shortly thereafter go on to transform the nation nationalism and nation capitalism into war and accumulation by dispossession that paid the lip service to the liberalism and to a degree even put its institutional foundations in place. In fact, their own deeds would paradoxically fail on the liberal standards they themselves have promulgated. An insight that was voiced by the perplexed Andrija Hebrang a couple of years ago. Andrija Hebrang is this member of HDZ, who is the son of an important resistance fighter, and he himself was, Andrija Hebrang was sort of the conservative, sometimes romanticist, sometimes hawkish nationalist. So an insight that was voiced by the perplexed Andrija Hebrang a couple of years ago when expressing his wonderment at the fact that it is them who have created the Croatian state that are now being criminalized by the state that they themselves have created. But the liberalism that was part and parcel of their nationalist program was not there for reasons of organic complementarity with their nationalist ideology. Rather, it was a standard element in the reformist narrative of already late Yugoslav period that desperately sought and could not come up with an alternative model to capitalist democracy in order to salvage at least some elements of the Yugoslav social and economic exception. The nationalists embraced the liberalism exactly because it was an already existing part of the popular imaginary of social transition, a vessel that allowed them to come to power and follow through their program in a more complete way. Thus, it's a complex historic evolution, but obviously liberalism was more than merely an oppositional project of progressives and professional elites that was installed only once the nationalists and their cronies were out of the game, or a set of disciplining measures forced upon these actors by the international community. In a way, it remains the intellectual task for the left to provide a plausible historic narrative for the Yugoslav dissolution and to disentangle the civil and social rights from their corporatist, nationalist, and possessive individualist trajectories in the 90s and the noughts. That work of disentanglement will probably also have to give an account of the other factors that have led to the lasting turmoil of the left since the 90s and the predicaments it faces today. First and foremost, the abandonment of the Yugoslav social and economic model by the Communist Party. Having found themselves on the defensive facing the processes of dissolution and the rise of nationalists, the Croatian communists, for instance, have completely abdicated from the political power, ceding the political territory to nationalists fair and square. Another important factor was either the dismantling or the marginalization of the relatively progressive institutional framework that was created and that existed in Yugoslavia, particularly in the fields of organized labor, youth, and culture. The exception were social institutions and protections that were left partially intact to buffer off the adverse effects of nationalist and capitalist offensive. The left has entered the 90s without the organization and the institutions. So, to summarize, the impediments that the left in the 90s, whatever there was of the left in the 90s, was forced to regroup and work under were the following: the withdrawal of the support for the anti-capitalist project, both by the broad segments of the society and the ruling elites, the transformation of property relations, the short thrift given to the pluralist composition of Yugoslav society and the ensuing war, the foreclosure of the left or the party of the left, and the dismantling of its institutional foundations. Except for the trade unions hurt by convertism in the 90s and initial disorientation in the context of nationalism, rare beleaguered academic institutions, mostly in the humanities, and several independent media outlets, the left could only have sought to continue to function outside of the state, the market, and the party. This also sets then the clear limits on the left that had to work within these that had to work within the civil society. It was marginal, oppositional, anti-populist, and modernist. It mostly focused on the brutal exclusions created by the war and privatization, or picked up the work from the dismantled progressive institutions of the system. It was reduced to appellative politics and struggling to find resources for its own work. Going back to the harsh judgment leveled against the civil society on the left that I've started from, all this doesn't fully absolve it from the critique, all these circumstances. It did settle within the limits tolerated by the state and the market, particularly as we go more and more into the north. But all this does point to where the continuity of structural predicament of doing the work on the left still lies today. So let me turn to understanding this current predicament of the left that has to function within limits of civil society. Much has changed since the latter part of the 90s when my organization started to work. There has been a widespread revival and acceptance of the anti-systemic analysis and several large-scale anti-systemic movements. Furthermore, the institutional landscape, particularly the public broadcasting service and trade unions, have opened up to the positions on the left, much in consequence to the ongoing crisis. Some on the left are even trying to penetrate the structures of existing parties or are considering entering the fray of electoral politics with new projects. But many on the left working within forms and formats of organized civil society remain, for many on the left working within forms and formats of organized civil society remains an objective circumstance under which they have to reproduce and sustain their political work in the coming future. Assuming that we do want to transcend the limited remit of civil society, constrained by the state on the one hand and the capital on the other, in the remaining talk I will try to focus in more detail on the constraints and challenges that follow from this objective circumstance of working within civil society in the present moment in Croatia. Challenges that have to do with the organizational form, conditions of labor, operative dynamics, media, and finally broader set of strategies that I think are needed to lead us out of the defensive that, in spite of the changing landscape, we still find ourselves in. On the risk of sounding aseptic and bureaucratic, I will try to look at things from a more pragmatic side of tasks that lie ahead. Self-organization admittedly, so first, deficits of organizational form. Self-organization admittedly allows for a lot of maneuvering space, as one is responsible primarily to one's own purposes and fellow comrades. There are few limitations set by the institutional arrangement of an association and few interests to negotiate. Collective action can unfold quickly without the complicated process of deliberation and balancing of opposing views, or at least too many thereof. However, this tactical facility comes at a price. Weak institutional constraints and lack of potentially paralyzing rank and file also point to the fact that organization has a weak leverage on the context and lacks the support of broader social forces, a base that will back up its political activities. In that respect, civil society organizations stand in stark contrast to trade unions. While the capacity of trade unions to react is often slow because it requires the coordination of the rank and file, once the industrial action has been agreed upon, it has a broad union membership to back it up, and it can easily succeed. At the same time, due to the processes of deindustrialization, bleeding of membership, compartmentalization of union work into single trades, and hawkish media reporting, trade unions have very limited political maneuvering space. While they can negotiate the material conditions for their members, it is rarely that they have the mandate and the strategy to transcend the struggle for immediate demands of their membership. The importance of struggle for wages and better conditions and better working conditions or against bad labor legislation cannot be overstated. But it rarely can succeed in transcending that narrow scope and overturning the overriding political dynamics given the circumstances. Unlike trade unions, the political parties on the left, although in Croatian parliamentary landscape neither the Social Democrats nor the Labour, strictly speaking, deserve that qualifier, so the political parties on the left are more and more resembling civil society organizations. Their membership has dwindled too. They no longer have the broad political base and social constituencies that would dictate the political organization from the orientation from the bottom up, and that they would be in turn held accountable to. When in power, they no longer pursue a political strategy, but are reduced to a technique of governance over social and economic affairs that is primarily driven by the approval rates and the extra-democratic alliances with media, capital, and international institutions. Entrenched positions in the party reflect more the interest of middle and top party ranks than that of broad social constituencies. And while some positions in the party might be more germane to the interest of various social groups it purports to represent, on the whole it remains volatile and dependent on the sway of public opinion. This is a condition, in some quarters also known as a post-political condition or post-democratic condition, that is shared by most of the social democratic and older parties on the left in Europe today. So turning now to conditions of work, stability of activities, and transforming own field of work. It is clear that broader anti-systemic, let me have some water. Am I too quick, or how is it? Okay. It is clear that broader anti-systemic political mobilization has a difficult and complex task ahead of itself. It has to articulate critical positions, create alliances with trade unions, mobilize other social forces, and understand that without taking power, no victory or concession will have lasting effect on the policy and the transformation of social arrangements. It's a puzzle that needs to be pieced together from different sides and hinges on careful building of trust, detection of opportunities, and forging of alliances. Even in situations of successful mobilization of an alliance with broader social forces, the bonds tend to remain brittle and can be difficult to sustain in the long run, as the interests between the actors are structurally different and focuses of work tend to grow apart over time. Hence, the tensions between trade unions and civil society organizations when they work together. The alliances that will be able to withstand the test of time need to be built on more than just discussion, understanding, and joint action. They will also probably require the meeting of structural interests. And there are indeed shared focuses and interests between activists working within civil society and broader sectors of labor that require addressing and can build more than just an interventionist dimension to alliances with trade unions. Namely, unless better conditions for project-based work can be created among activists, and unless unions find a way to address the problem of increasing numbers of flexibilized workers, it will be a short ride together. It is not only that the trade unions need helping from this side. In fact, the opposite might be the case. Many of the newly created organizations won't be able to continue working over a long period of time unless they are able to secure the livelihood of their activists and their resources needed for the organizational work. This means finding ways within organizations of securing social stability for the people working, but also advocating and securing fair remuneration for labor and structural support in their respective fields. It is highly alarming, for instance, that the part of civil society activities that was hit hardest by the austerity measures of the current government are the activities in the field of social care and labor, where, for instance, multi-annual support was cut last year by 60%. If the growing plethora of leftist initiatives and organizations is to survive in the long run, the effort needs to be undertaken in advocating policy changes that will bring more support to the work in the field. This could have long-term effects on the stability of activities, create better working conditions, prevent the bleeding of people who will eventually have to leave to do something else to secure their livelihood. Some such interventions have been done in culture and media, where there have been intermittent yet lasting improvements for the actors working outside the institutions of the system. But in the field of social care and labor, that advocacy and policy effort needs to be done with greater persuasiveness and done urgently. With the foreign funders being so few, the importance of this policy work cannot be understated. And these innovations have to be made whenever possible through policy change, so that they cannot be easily undone once the forces in power change. So I'll turn now more to policy and advocacy work. How am I doing with time?
5 minutes.
5 minutes more. Okay, I think I'm going to finish in 5 minutes. But looking beyond the securing of conditions for own work, there is a number of challenges in policy and advocacy that are waiting to be taken up. Firstly, as was discussed a moment ago, it is the transformation of labor legislation and growing flexibilization of work arrangements in general that is an issue of double relevance for the reproduction of the left. While precarity has been a constant feature for those working in activist and media organizations, it has over the last decade become also the prevailing condition for the greater part of the workforce. This is a topic where trade unions face limitations. Precarious workers are not easy to unionize. Unionization only increases the insecurity of those precarious workers. Wage dumping through precarious work is hurting unionized workers. Ultimately, unions are losing their membership to the flexibilization of work arrangements. It is thus around this topic that alliances can be forged. Activist organizations, not being bound by the social compact, might command the maneuvering space that is not available to trade unions and can discursively articulate, advocate, and mobilize broader forces around policy change. Furthermore, it is the protection of public and communal services from another wave of marketization and privatization that will no doubt remain a catalyzing activity for the non-institutional left. There is a direct link between the commodification of public services, whereby their provision is subsumed under the logic of profit extraction, and whereby the equality of provision is subordinate to the rationalization of costs of labor and investment, and the reduction of workforce and their rights in those services. And this link, increasingly becoming clear to the public through the growing prices of commodified services and the looming cost of socialization of private risk to taxpayers, can in turn serve as a basis for broader mobilizations beyond the immediate interests of one's own constituency. However, this link still requires explaining to the public in order to become obvious. And this needs to be done before it's too late. But it is a difficult task, given that the commercial media are hawkishly pitting users of services against providers of services, or are pitting private sector workers against public sector workers by exploiting the asynchronous trajectories of proletarization in respective fields. As can be seen from the recent campaign of the daily Jutarnji List, who has joined forces with the private health service providers, spreading fear, uncertainty, and danger over public services is more than just an ideological sleight of hand. It's an actual business model allowing print media to expand into other businesses. Speaking of media, it is the change of media policy that calls for attention too. While creating independent media outlets in print or in internet is important for the articulation of critical discourse, analysis, and creation of shared orientation within the leftist ranks, obviously a successful counter-hegemonic strategy cannot be achieved without a penetration into the mainstream broadcasting media. Public broadcasting service is an important element in that strategy. However, it is a volatile institution dependent on the sway of political forces and institutional power game. However, the significant changes are needed in the spectrum allocation and public media financing policies, giving priority after years of privileging commercial media to non-commercial, professional, and community radio and television stations. The parity between commercial and non-commercial has to be established across all scales and territories of frequency allocation. Non-commercial allocations in small communities where commercial media find no interest are important, but it is only there where the competition for the airwaves is strong and the audiences are large that a struggle for the heart and mind can be pursued. It is thus, in the Croatian case, that Council for Electronic Media and the Ministry of Culture have to be pushed to set the allocation and financing priorities accordingly. Obviously, all these constraints and challenges in building a sustainable civil work on the left that I have emphasized, they all have to go hand in hand with the work in education, expert bodies, political committees, and governance structures. As recent activist campaigns have demonstrated, it is only the capacity to engage a variety of parallel strategies: critical analysis, popular mobilization, juridical contestation, advocacy, media, and last but not least, transgressions, that allows for political subjectivation that stands any chance of calling into question the iron logic of neoliberal doctrine. But they have also shown that regardless of the scale and impact, they are still not enough to bring about the desired change. Struggles that have mobilized the largest popular support and energies are being lost to political actors that are now leading us into yet another round of comprehensive marketization and privatization of public sector and public resources. It stands to reason that without taking political power, or at least strategically significant part in it, struggles will continue to be lost. Without the entry into the electoral political fray, however, there will be little chance for the left of achieving lasting changes. But by placing all our eggs into the electoral basket for reasons of structural deficits of the political system that I have outlined, even less. We need to explore the opportunities for electoral engagement while continuing the work on the other fronts. In what organizational form exactly and on what occasion, I think that remains for careful consideration. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. That was lovely. And when I say, lovely, I mean provocative, especially in the context of the recent debates about whether neoliberalism ever touched the fragile Croatian soil. But to leave these issues to the later discussion, I will now give the floor to Danijela. Thank you, Danijela. So now we have about half an hour for a discussion. 20 minutes. 20 minutes? Half an hour. Half an hour. I was about to say myths and comments. About for questions and comments, not myths and comments. So please don't hesitate. Be brave.
No, I mean, they were great presentations, really. Tom, I mean, there was a little moment, I mean, I want you to be more experiential and more pragmatic, actually, in some ways, because I felt there was a moment where you put civil rights and social rights together, which is fine, of course, as a claim, but in the 90s, there was no work done on social rights. It was all on civil rights. And therefore, that relationship between civil and social rights becomes problematic and difficult, partly because there was a real connection, albeit a liberal one, between advocacy work on civil rights and experiential work on the ground on social rights, on civil rights. Whereas you made the point, in a sense, that all the work on social rights was actually not about social rights at all. It was amelioration. It was simply substituting for a deconstructed welfare state. That's a way to the question, which is, I'm delighted to see the move into a policy platform on social rights. but how could a consensus emerge on that? What kinds of things would be important? Because I just take one issue, minimum income guarantee, which has become extraordinarily popular amongst a certain strand of the left. But the debate or the problem about whether that is itself a form of commodification which might undermine access to community-based social services for the most vulnerable hasn't really been heard. So that how one thinks about policy platform would be my question. What would be the elements on which a consensus, a transformative and progressive consensus could be developed?
So, to the first part of your commentary, the first question in relation to between civil and social rights in the 90s, I think that a class analysis would be in order to understand where short-sightedness and kind of disconnect between the two sides of the problem happened, and between the actors that did work on those issues. And it would probably have to go back into the 80s. However, I do not command the empirical indications to say more about that. I could just speculate that probably civil society of the 90s, those were mostly kids of administrative workers, academics, and that they had very little access already prior to the 90s to the sphere of industrial labor, and in many ways vice versa. You know, one could also look at what has happened. I mean, what is the class story behind the ideology that ushered us into the 90s? So how the disillusionment was structured and distributed across different classes. I think that would be an interesting story to find out who was exactly disillusioned by the Yugoslav model and who was basically providing the consensus for the processes of dissolution. So I think that's in order, though I'm not in position to answer. And your second question, I think I'm even less in a position to answer. Probably you're a better person to respond to that. It's very difficult to say what will create consensus, but I think it's also, we are at the stage where it's more creating a connection that was missing, the missing link between various social actors that have to bring forth such a consensus. It's hard to say in a prescriptive way what that should be. Though I guess external events are basically dictating at this moment what most of the actors are doing. So in terms of analysis of the situation and discursive articulation, in terms of trade unions, in terms of social work, I think those are in many respects disconnected also by the course of events and the dictate of the events. But yeah, maybe you could answer better.
Okay, is there a question for Paul or
yeah, if he
no?
wants to follow up.
Okay. Any more questions? Okay, that's good because we're just out of time. We'll have a brief recess and then we'll gather here at noon, at high noon. Thank you. Yeah, and there's coffee outside.